Have you ever seen dignity stripped away in plain daylight? Under the fading sun, the field behind the old barn trembles with the echo of wooden muskets striking the dirt. Poor farmers' boys, widowers, sons of hunger train like soldiers under the bitter gaze of British officers. Their laughter carries scorn, their eyes contempt. To them, these men are nothing but peasants pretending to be warriors. And yet one voice dares to rise above the dust. Margaret Hale, the widow of a fallen captain. Her hands no longer weave linen or mend clothes. They forge courage. But in a world ruled by redcoats and arrogance, a woman teaching men to fight is a crime of defiance. Whispers follow her every step. She's lost her mind. She should be silent. Still she stands. For freedom. For the promise her husband died for. While the English mock, she trains patriots not with power, but with faith, discipline, and fire. They may doubt her now, but history remembers those who refuse to kneel. Welcome. Patriot, are you already subscribed to this cause? Then give the story your like so others may find the courage to rise too. Alright then, now we can begin. Briggs watched her like a wolf waiting for weakness. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror, but his heart was made of rust. Every order Margaret gave, every correction she made to the trembling recruits, he answered with a smirk, a silent promise of humiliation. A widow teaching soldiers, he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. The colonies must be rotting from the inside. The laughter that followed was sharp as a whip, lashed through the air, cutting into the dignity of every man who stood before her. None dared speak. They had seen what happened to those who did. Margaret didn't look away. Her voice stayed calm, almost cold. Discipline begins with silence, she said. Her eyes, steady and unyielding, met the Englishman's glare. Briggs stepped closer, boots crushing the dirt where her husband once trained. He wanted her to tremble. He wanted to see the spark die. But Margaret had already buried fear with her husband's body. The fire that burned in her was grief, turned into defiance. Still the soldiers hesitated. Their hands shook when they held their rifles, not from fatigue but from shame. They were caught between two powers, the empire that ruled them, and the woman who dared to awaken their pride. Briggs could feel it too, the tension of rebellion growing under their skin. So he pushed. Harder, you think these peasants will fight? He barked. They can't even hold a musket straight. He grabbed a boy barely 17, twisting his arm until the weapon dropped to the ground. This, he said, is your army of heroes. Something broke inside Margaret, then not fear but patience. She stepped forward, her boots sinking in the dust. Pick it up, she told the boy. Her tone was gentle, but there was steel behind it. He doesn't decide your worth. The boy obeyed, eyes wet, jaw trembling. Margaret turned to Briggs. You may command men through fear, she said, but I command them through purpose. The words hit him like a slap. For a moment silence ruled the field. Then Briggs laughed, cruel and loud. Purpose? He sneered. Your purpose died with your husband. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Even the British officers looked uneasy. But Margaret stood her ground, her face pale as marble. Then I carry his spirit, she answered. And that's something you'll never understand. The day dragged on, heavy with humiliation and dust. The recruits trained until their hands bled, while the English watched with bored contempt. Each mistake was met with ridicule, each stumble with mock applause. Yet beneath the scorn, something was changing. The men no longer avoided Margaret's eyes. They began to move as one, their strikes sharper, their voices louder. Even Briggs felt it, a strange unity rising where despair once lived. At sunset, he found her alone near washing the grime from her hands. The orange light carved shadows across her face. You think you've earned their respect, he said, stepping close enough for her to smell the brandy on his breath. But they follow you because they fear what will happen if they don't. She didn't answer. You're a danger to yourself, he continued, his tone shifting to something darker. And to them, the crown doesn't forgive rebellion. Margaret lifted her gaze. Then the crown will learn the cost of arrogance. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. For the first time, Briggs hesitated. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken truth, a revelation of what pain can become when it refuses to die. That night, as the recruits slept in silence, Briggs gathered with the other officers in the barn. They spoke in whispers, their faces lit by the dim glow of lanterns. Words like insubordination, discipline, and example filled the air. Margaret's name was spoken like a threat. That needed to be erased. Outside, the wind howled through the fields, carrying the scent of rain and destiny. Meanwhile, Margaret walked among the sleeping men, adjusting blankets, whispering quiet prayers for each. Her heart was heavy, but her will was carved from something harder than sorrow. Freedom was no longer an idea, it was a vow. And every insult, every wound, every drop of sweat spilled under that cruel sun was shaping them into more than soldiers, into patriots. She didn't know that. Briggs was already planning his strike, nor that the next dawn would bring betrayal cloaked in orders. All she knew was that their journey had begun, that the road to liberty was paved not with glory, but with sacrifice and the courage to face disgrace without lowering one's eyes. The storm was coming, and somewhere in its dark heart, the widow of the colonies was ready to face it. The courtyard fell silent when Briggs stepped forward. His boots struck the dirt with slow, deliberate confidence, and the murmurs of the men faded into uneasy quiet. "Let me show you, madam," he said, his tone dripping with mock courtesy. "Your movements lack strength. Allow me to correct them." The recruits exchanged glances, uncertain whether to look or turn away. Margaret stood in the center of the yard, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the man who had turned their training into theater. She knew what was coming. He didn't want to teach. He wanted to humiliate. Briggs circled her like a predator, grinning as he raised his fists. The air was heavy, still. Dust swirled around their feet, glowing in the late sun. Then, without warning, his elbow slammed across her face. The sound was sharp, like a branch snapping in the wind. She stumbled, the world spinning for a moment before her knees found the ground. A drop of blood fell onto the dirt, then another. The soldiers gasped. Some flinched, others looked away. The English officers didn't. They laughed. "Clumsy, wasn't it?" Briggs said, feigning surprise. "My apologies, Widow Hale. I sometimes forget how fragile your kind can be." The laughter grew, cruel and contagious. The patriots watched in silence, their faces hard with rage they didn't dare show. Margaret wiped the blood from her lips. Her hand trembled, but her gaze did not. She rose slowly, each movement deliberate, each breath a refusal. The world around her blurred, the jeers, the whispers, the smirks, but she heard one thing clearly, the thundering beat of her own. Heart still steady, still alive. She looked at Briggs and spoke, voice calm, low, unbroken. "The lesson ends here." For a moment no one moved. Then she walked away, her steps slow, her dignity unbent. Even bleeding, she carried herself with more strength than any uniformed tyrant. The laughter faltered as she passed. Shame followed in her wake, thick and suffocating. The young recruits stood frozen, their chests burning with something new, not fear, but fury. For the first time they saw what true courage looked like. It wasn't in the blade or the musket. It was in the will to stand after being struck down. Briggs called after her, mocking, "Leaving so soon? Don't forget to teach your men how to fall." But his words met silence. Margaret didn't turn. She didn't need to. The seed had already been planted. Her blood on the ground had spoken louder than any speech. It was a mark of sacrifice, a silent vow carved into the heart of every man who had witnessed it. That night the camp was different. The usual murmurs of exhaustion were replaced by quiet whispers of anger. The recruits gathered in small circles, speaking of dignity, of liberty, of the day's disgrace. Some wept in silence. Others clenched their fists. Each man carried the same question inside him. How long would they endure this degradation before rising? In the barn, the lantern flickered over faces hardened by decision. Margaret sat apart, pressing a cloth to her bruised cheek. She neither cried nor spoke. Her silence carried the weight of the nation's struggle unseen, unheard yet unstoppable. A boy approached her, the same one Briggs had mocked days earlier. "Ma'am," he whispered, voice trembling, "why didn't you strike him back?" She looked at him, eyes soft but distant. "Because this isn't about pride," she said. "It's about awakening. When a tyrant strikes, he reveals what he fears most, the spirit he cannot break." Her words hung in the air, quiet but fierce. The boy nodded, something burning behind his eyes. That night he would not sleep, nor would many others. Briggs, meanwhile, celebrated his small victory with ale and arrogance. In his tent, he boasted to his peers about the lesson he'd taught the widow of the rebellion. They laughed, blind to the shift beneath their feet. Every empire falls the same way, slowly at first, unseen from within. The humiliation meant to destroy her had transformed into something far greater, a spark that would soon ignite rebellion. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm that had been waiting now approached, dark and steady. Margaret stepped out into the night air, the cold wind stinging her wounds. She looked toward the horizon, where the hills melted into shadow. Somewhere out there, men were already gathering, hearts heavy with rage and hope. She could feel it, the beginning of change, the quiet rise of defiance. The next morning would bring consequences. Briggs would not forget the silence that defied him, nor the eyes that no longer bowed. Orders would come. Punishments would follow, but the transformation had already begun. Beneath the weight of disgrace, something sacred was awakening, the birth of a people ready to claim their dignity, no matter the cost. And as dawn crept over the fields, painting the world in pale gold. Margaret stood alone in the yard where her blood had dried. She touched the mark in the dirt and whispered to the wind, "Liberty grows where they try to bury it." Then she closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of footsteps, because she knew the enemy would not stay silent for long. The water was cold, sharp as glass. Each drop that touched her skin carried the sting of memory. Margaret leaned over the bucket, her reflection fractured by ripples. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to the color of dusk. She pressed her fingers against it, not out of pain, but to feel the truth it carried, the mark of defiance. Around her, the walls of the small shelter trembled with wind. Outside, the night moaned like a wounded thing. Yet inside, she stood still, breathing slow, steady, unbroken. Her husband's voice returned in the silence, a whisper from another time. "Discipline triumphs when anger fails." Those were his last words, before he rode into the storm of musket fire and never came back. Margaret closed her eyes. She could still see his smile, his hands rough from toil, his faith in a liberty he never lived to see. She had buried him with her own hands, but not his, because that flame had never gone out. It had only changed shape. Now it burned through her veins. The insult she endured today was more than personal. It was a reflection of every woman and man the crown had crushed beneath its pride. Briggs believed he had humiliated her. In truth, he had only unmasked himself, a coward hiding behind authority. She thought of his laughter, the echo of his cruelty, and she realized something that chilled her more than pain. Oppression fears serenity. Tyrants understand rage. They do not understand calm. Her silence today had terrified him. That was the revelation she had needed. The door creaked open. A shadow lingered in the doorway. It was Thomas, one of the younger recruits, carrying a torn piece of cloth. "Miss Hale," he whispered, "you should rest. The men are worried." She turned to him, her face half hidden by candlelight. "Tell them not to worry," she said. "Tell them to remember what they saw. That is rest enough for me." He hesitated, then offered her the cloth. "For your wound," he said softly. She took it, nodding in gratitude. When he left, she watched the candle flame shiver in the draught, small, fragile, yet undefeated. Outside, the camp was restless. The recruits whispered in the dark, their anger growing like roots beneath the soil. They spoke of justice, of the shame they'd witnessed, of how the Empire's dignity was nothing but polished rot. Some wanted vengeance, others wanted guidance. All waited for a sign. And though she didn't know it, Margaret had already given them one. Her silence had become their banner. The night stretched long. She couldn't sleep. Every sound outside, a rustle, a step, a faint metallic click, carried the weight of suspicion. The British were restless too. She could feel their unease, the way they avoided her gaze during the day, the way they whispered in corners. The humiliation they'd staged had not satisfied them. It had unsettled them, because something in that courtyard had shifted, something they couldn't name but could not ignore. Near dawn, she stepped outside. The air was cold enough to bite. The horizon was a thin line of gray, neither night nor day, a world between endings and beginnings. She walked toward the empty field where her blood had dried. The dirt still held the faint stain, dark and quiet like a secret. She knelt, touching it with her fingertips. "You died for liberty," she murmured, speaking to her husband, to the earth, to every fallen soul, whose name had been buried by silence. "I live for it." Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Captain Hargreaves, the senior British officer, his coat heavy with medals and contempt. "You've caused quite a spectacle," he said, voice smooth but poisonous. "You think your little rebellion of manners will earn you respect?" Margaret rose slowly, meeting his eyes. "Respect isn't given by those who lack it," she said. "It's earned by those who endure." Hargreaves chuckled. "Careful, widow. Rebellion can be quiet too, until it's punished." He turned to leave, but his last words lingered in the air like smoke. The crown has no mercy for insolence. As his figure disappeared into the mist, Margaret felt no fear, only clarity. Betrayal was coming. She could sense it. The British would not let this defiance go unanswered. But she had already made her decision. If dignity required sacrifice, then sacrifice would be her offering. What frightened her was not death, but the thought of these young men dying without purpose. They needed faith. They needed to believe that submission was not survival, that rebellion, even in defeat, could be holy. She returned to the barracks, watching the sleeping faces of her recruits. Farmers, sons, dreamers, none born soldiers, yet all marked by the same hunger for independence. She whispered to them as if blessing each one, "Tomorrow, you stand taller. Tomorrow, you fight not with rage, but with resolve." The words were not meant to reach their ears, only their spirits. A gust of wind blew the candle out. Darkness swallowed the room, but Margaret smiled faintly. The night before battle always feels like surrender, yet it never is. Somewhere deep in her heart, she knew the journey was leading toward revelation, a hidden truth that would demand everything she had left. And as dawn began to break, painting the clouds in pale red, Margaret stood once more by the window, the bruise on her face fading into memory. The empire still, that believed her broken. But what they didn't see was that beneath the wound, a storm was forming, a storm not of vengeance but of transformation. And when it came, no amount of gold or guns would silence it. The night wrapped itself around the camp like a shroud. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder. Inside her dim shelter, Margaret lit a single candle and pulled from beneath her cot an old leather-bound manual. The cover was cracked. The pages yellowed with time. Her husband's handwriting still marked the margins, small notes in the language of soldiers. Calm is control. Control is victory. She traced the letters with trembling fingers. His ghost was there, between the ink and the silence. She turned the pages slowly, reading every commandment of British combat. Maintain posture. Strike with precision. Never let emotion dictate the hand. Words meant to build their empire. Words she would now use to dismantle it. With each line, her mind sharpened. She began to see their weaknesses. Arrogance disguised as discipline. Cruelty mistaken for authority. Briggs had broken every rule he pretended to teach. He was not a soldier of honor. He was a beast dressed in a crown's uniform. The candlelight danced over her bruised cheek as she studied. The sting no longer hurt. It reminded her of purpose. She imagined her husband standing beside her, watching her read, proud of the strength he had left behind. You taught them war, she whispered to the ghost of the man who'd once held her. Now I'll teach them consequence. Outside, footsteps stirred. One of the young recruits, Peter, peeked through the doorway. You're still awake, ma'am? He asked softly. It's almost dawn. She didn't look up. I know, she said. And by dawn, we'll be ready. The boy hesitated. Ready for what? Her eyes lifted then, catching his. Steady, bright, cold as steel. For dignity. As he left, she continued her work. She tore a page from the manual and folded it neatly, tucking it into her sleeve. It was the section on defensive engagement, the art of turning an opponent's strength into their downfall. She whispered the steps under her breath, the balance, the grip, the counterstrike. Not to fight with rage, but with knowledge. That would be her rebellion. Not loud, not bloody, precise. When the first light crept over the horizon, the field awoke under a shroud of fog. The recruits assembled for training, their faces pale from sleeplessness. The British officers arrived soon after, boots crushing the frost, laughter cutting through the morning like blades. Briggs walked at the front, his voice already booming with false cheer. Rise and shine, boys. Let's see if our dear lady instructor has recovered from her little stumble. His grin was wide, confident, cruel. Margaret stepped forward before he could say more. Sergeant, she said calmly, if you're so eager to demonstrate proper technique, perhaps we should follow the manual, your manual. The other officers looked at one another, intrigued. Briggs tilted his head, mock amusement flickering in his eyes. You read the Crown's combat texts? Every line, she said, and I'd like to test one. He accepted, eager for another chance to humiliate her. Very well. Let's educate the peasants, shall we? He removed his coat and handed it to a soldier, stepping into the dirt. The men formed a circle around them, the tension so heavy it pressed against the chest. Margaret stood across from him, hands steady, breathing slow. She looked small before him, fragile almost, until she spoke. Begin whenever you're ready. Briggs lunged, just as she expected, heavy, overconfident, breaking every rule of form. Margaret sidestepped, using his weight against him. The crowd gasped as he stumbled. She didn't strike. She waited, her calm disarming him more than any blow. He came again, faster, angrier. This time she met him halfway, turning his momentum into collapse. In one motion he was on the ground, the breath punched out of his chest. Silence fell over the yard. The recruits stood frozen, the British stunned. Margaret stepped back, eyes cold, voice steady. According to your manual, Sergeant, she said. That's called loss of control. Briggs rose, red-faced, humiliated before the men he commanded. He charged again, shouting, You insolent! But she caught his arm, twisted, and forced him to his knees. His face met the dirt, the same dirt that had once tasted her blood. She released him at once, turning to the recruits. Discipline, she said, her voice carrying across the field, is not measured by domination but by restraint. Remember that. The silence that followed was sacred. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The colonists stood taller. The English looked smaller. Briggs did not rise right away. His pride was heavier than his body. When he finally stood, his glare burned with hatred. You'll regret this, he hissed. She met his eyes without flinching. No, she said softly. You will. As she walked away, the recruits parted before her like a tide. For the first time, they looked at her not as a teacher but as a leader. The lesson was complete, yet she knew the cost was only beginning. Briggs would not let this stand. Neither would Hargreaves. The Empire never forgave humiliation, especially when it came from those they deemed beneath them. That night, while the camp quieted into uneasy rest, Margaret sat alone by the dying fire. The manual lay open on her knees, the ink glistening faintly in the ember's light. She thought of what she had done, not as revenge, but as declaration. The rebellion was no longer just an idea whispered in taverns. It was alive, breathing, taking shape in the hearts of men. But she also knew what always followed awakening: betrayal. The British would strike back, not with open war, but with deceit. And as she stared into the embers, she understood that her journey was about to cross into darkness deeper than anything she had yet faced. The candle burned low, flickering like a dying heartbeat. Margaret closed the manual and whispered, "Your rules, your downfall." Then somewhere beyond the fields, a distant horn echoed, a signal in the night. She turned toward the sound, eyes narrowed. The storm had found her again. Morning rose like a blade. The fog clung low over the field, muting the colors, softening nothing. Margaret stood in the center of the yard and called the men to her. No shout, no bravado, just the steady voice that had become their metronome. "Exercise of discipline and reflex," she announced. "No bravado, no rage, only control." The British commander agreed out of curiosity, the kind that confuses pride with courage. Briggs strutted forward with his companions, already smiling at the idea of a new spectacle. The colonists gathered at the edges, faces tight with expectation. The silence of the oppressed pressed into their lungs. She drew a circle in the dirt with the heel of her boot. "Inside this boundary," she said, "there is a rule. The first to break posture loses." She held up the folded page from the Crown's manual, the very ink of their empire. "Grip, balance, distance. You know the words," she told the redcoats. "Let's see who respects them." The first drill looked harmless. Two men facing each other, palms open, stepping in rhythm. But rhythm reveals the soul. The British advanced with heavy pride, shouldering forward as if shoving fear itself. Margaret corrected the colonists gently. "Breathe. Anchor the heel." Hands relaxed. When the redcoats lunged to intimidate, their weight betrayed them. In a breath, Peter turned to stumble into a clean deflection. A British corporal collapsed to a knee. Gasps, then stillness. No cheering. Not today. Dignity kept its own counsel. Briggs entered the ring with a grin he wore like armor. "My turn," he said. Margaret nodded and chose Thomas, the thin boy, who had once trembled under ridicule. She positioned him with slow precision, shoulders down, spine tall, eyes on the chest, not the face. "See the rhythm," she whispered. "Use his impatience." Briggs surged. Thomas slipped past him as a reed parts water, palm redirecting force instead of meeting it. The sergeant spun, surprised, then charged again, contempt heating his blood. Thomas did not strike. He yielded, then set small corrections, exact angles, the lawful geometry of defense. On the third pass, Briggs overreached. Thomas caught the wrist, turned the elbow, and stopped just short of breaking it. The circle held its breath. Margaret's voice cut clean. "Hold, release." The boy obeyed. The sergeant's face, flushed with shame, darkened further. Humiliation had found its mark without a single insult. They moved to the second phase, eyes closed, listening only. Margaret rang a small brass bell her husband once carried. "Step toward the sound, not toward the taunt," she said. "Your enemy will speak to your pride. Ignore the voice. Obey the measure." The colonists found the cadence quickly. The British mocked the method as witchcraft, then tripped over their own swagger. A noble officer swore. Another laughed to hide embarrassment. The recruits did not laugh. They learned. Each success stacked upon the wounded dignity of the day before, turning disgrace into muscle memory. Hargreaves watched with an unreadable gaze. His silence felt colder than Briggs's jeers. He measured. Risks, not honor. Margaret knew the type. Merchants of obedience. Selling order for a price the poor cannot pay. She called the final drill. Contact and restraint. Partners gripped wrists and tried to pull each other off balance without crossing the circle. No strikes. No fury, only structure. One by one, the farmers held their ground. The old man with a ruined knee, the miller with frayed sleeves, the stable boy who had never held a sword. Even a widow's calm could steal a town. Briggs demanded a rematch, this time with Margaret. "No dodging," he barked. "Hands only." She stepped into the dust with the manual visible in her sash. "We honor your rules," she said. "All of them." He seized her wrist. She did not resist. She adjusted a breath, shifted a foot, and let him pull. When his balance tilted, the circle seemed to tilt with him. She guided his momentum downward and pinned him, not violently, not cruelly, simply and decisively. The bell chimed at her shoulder. She released him the instant the note faded. Restraint ends when the lesson is learned, she said. The recruits stood taller. The redcoats stared. Hargreaves narrowed his eyes, weighing a problem that discipline could not solve. The exercise ended without applause. Margaret dismissed the men, then spoke to no one in particular. Independence begins in the spine before it reaches the flag. The words slid into the marrow of the crowd. A small transformation, quiet as a heartbeat, ran across the yard. The humiliation of yesterday had turned into direction. Decisions waited like loaded muskets. By midday, the fog burned away. Heat settled, heavy. The British officers withdrew to the barn, faces tight, voices low. Margaret drank from the well and felt the water catch in her throat. She had won a field, not a war. Victory, even modest, invites reprisal. A young girl from the kitchens approached with a folded scrap. "For you," she whispered. Inside, a rushed hand had written, "They speak of an example. Tonight, not a beating, a removal, no signature. Only a blot where a tear had fallen." Margaret folded the note back along the crease. The hidden truth of rule is this: power prefers darkness. Sunlight makes it clumsy. Night makes it brave. She walked the perimeter, eyes on the tree line. Memory rose, unbidden. Her husband's last march. The promise he pressed into her palm with his ring. Guard their hope, even from themselves. The price of that promise had always been sacrifice. She could pay it. What she could not bear was the thought of boys thrown to wolves for her defiance. Her mind traced paths of escape, lines of protection, silent contingencies. If they came for her, she would go without a struggle. If they reached for the recruits, she would become iron. Near dusk, clouds gathered again. The wind changed direction, bringing a smell like wet ash. Margaret gathered the men for a final word before evening tasks. "You did well," she said simply. "Stand straight. Speak less. See more." Peter asked what all feared to say. "If they punish us?" She met his gaze. "Punishment is their language. Constancy will be ours." And then lower, only for him. "Do not meet contempt with rage. Meet it with clarity. It breaks slower, but it breaks." Hargreaves reappeared with written orders sealed in wax. Ceremony cloaked aggression. "Instructor Hale," he announced, voice smooth as lacquer, "for the harmony of this encampment, you will be reassigned to a secure quarter for review." The word tasted of chains. Briggs smirked behind him, cheeks still smarting from the morning's disgrace. The recruits stiffened. Hands twitched toward tools that might become weapons. Margaret stepped forward before heat could ignite. "I comply," she said, and turned to her men with a look that asked for patience and gave resolve. "Continue the regimen." As the officers closed in, she lifted the manual once more, almost like a prayer. "Your rules," she murmured, not to them, not even to herself, but to the silence that had watched over the day. "Will witness what you do." Then she surrendered the book to Peter with a subtle nod, a passing of a torch disguised as routine. The boy understood. Something older than fear settled in his face. The escort formed around her. Boots thudded. The yard opened. The sky, bruised and low, pressed upon the camp. Margaret walked without bending. The bruise on her cheek faded. The flame inside sharpened into a wire. She had chosen her path. The journey had entered its narrowest pass. And in that narrowing, where breath shortens and hearts decide, the first true revelation drew near, waiting just beyond the barn's dark door. The courtyard waited like a held breath. Margaret walked to the center with a calm that unnerved even the wind. In her hands, a strip of cloth, then another, then several more. She held one out to Briggs first. "Discipline acts only when a threat is confirmed," she said, "not when pride is insulted." He scoffed, but the eyes. Around him, officers, merchants in polished boots. A noble with a neat ribbon at his throat glittered with curiosity. He took the blindfold to prove he feared nothing. The others followed, laughing at their own courage. The laughter sounded thin. She tied the fabric herself, not firm, not cruel. Quote, one by one, the sergeants stood in line, sightless and sure of their strength. The colonists formed a circle at the edges. Farmers with straw clinging to their cuffs. A gray-haired militiaman leaning on a stick. A kitchen girl with flour on her sleeve. Children peeking from the barn door. They watched in silence, dignity returning to their shoulders like a remembered coat. "React only to contact," Margaret said. No guessing. No striking at shadows. She stepped behind the first redcoat and laid 2 fingers against his forearm, a touch light as moth wings, and moved. He swung into emptiness, overbalanced, lost. She guided him down with a small turn of the wrist. No pain, no spectacle, just gravity. "And truth," the man grunted, ashamed. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. She repeated the lesson with the next. A brush at the shoulder, a measured pivot, a quiet fall. Technique, not fury. Control, not impulse. The ground received them without malice. Quote, by the third attempt, the courtyard had grown so still that the bell of a distant cow could be counted between heartbeats. Griggs stiffened under the cloth, jaw clenched. Come then, he said. Enough of these parlor tricks. Margaret did not rush. She circled once, listening to the rasp of his breath, the impatience straining his stance. When she touched the inside of his elbow, he struck blindly, wide, reckless, his own disgrace made visible. She slipped under the arc, hands arranging his momentum like a seamstress lays a hem. His knee buckled. She eased him down until the dust kissed his cheek. He ripped the blindfold free, cheeks burning with degradation. No one laughed now. Even contempt had lost its voice. Hargreaves's expression hardened into porcelain. He understood what this silence meant. Authority survives ridicule, but it rarely survives proof. Margaret addressed the circle, voice low and steady. Impulse is the tyrant's counsel. Precision is the patriot's ally. The words didn't shout, they settled. Men shifted their weight, standing truer on their heels. The old man's fingers tightened around his stick as if it had become a standard. She continued the drill. Variations. A tap at the shoulder blade, followed by a step to the left. A palm on the spine, paired with a sudden retreat. A feint of touch that went unanswered because the rule demanded certainty. The British stumbled and cursed. More fell. None were injured. Humiliation came not from pain, but from revelation. They were not invincible. They were untrained in the one art that defeats cruelty restraint. The kitchen girl crossed herself. The stable boy stared as if a hidden truth had slipped from the manual into the world. Briggs tried again without. The blindfold. Enough games, he growled. Face me as men face men. Margaret didn't flinch. As humans face conscience, she replied. He lunged. She guided. He raged. She refused. Every decision she made honored boundaries he had broken. No elbow meant to bruise. No knee to humiliate. Only angles and balance. When he fell the second time, the dust rose around him like smoke from a ruined altar. He stayed down long enough for the shame to soak into his uniform. The recruits kept their silence. This was not triumph, it was instruction. They were learning how to reverse a chain without breaking the neck that wore it. Hargreaves glanced toward the barn where his clerks tallied supplies and punishments. His jaw moved once. He had measured what fear could not hide. The colony's spirit had found its axis. Margaret addressed the men again. Liberty is not noise. It is posture. She lifted a hand and the colonists mirrored her stance, chin level, shoulders set, feet rooted in ordinary earth that had tasted their sweat and grief. Something passed through them, a transformation that looked small to the eye and vast to the soul. The Crown's manual lay folded at her belt, a scripture turned against its priesthood. Then a movement at the edge of the crowd. A merchant fat with contracts, thin on courage, spat near Peter's boots. Peasant tricks, he sneered. Peter didn't react. He breathed. He anchored the heel. He let the insult fall like rain on stone. The merchant faltered, unnerved by dignity he could not buy. Women by the door exchanged a glance that carried 10 winters of hunger and twice as many prayers. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the birds seemed to hold their wings. Briggs staggered to his feet. He spoke softly now, which made the venom worse. You think this proves virtue? It proves only that rebellion hides in lace gloves. Margaret answered without heat. Rebellion hides nowhere. It stands where it must. Her bruise had paled to the color of old roses. The quiet around her felt like the calm inside a church when the door shuts before a storm. Hargreaves stepped forward as if to end it, but she raised her palm. One final measure, she said. Not a contest. A vow. She walked to the line of colonists and faced them. You will not strike first. You will not answer spit with blood. You will hold your ground and keep your eyes. She turned to the redcoats. If you seek our submission, look for it in your own rulebook. You will not find it. No boast. No plea. Only a boundary. The commander's lips thinned. This display is concluded. He spoke as if pushing a lid onto a boiling pot. The men dispersed in uneasy fragments. The laughter did not return. In its place, a colder sound. Calculation. Paper would move tonight. Seals would crack. Orders would slip from wax like snakes from skin. Margaret knew it. So did the boys who refused to meet her eyes because they feared what it would cost to stand beside her. Dusk bent over the yard. She gathered, the blindfolds as if collecting relics. Peter approached, the manual hidden under his coat. If they take you, he whispered. Do we? He stopped, searching for a word that did not end in graves. She spared him the burden. If they move one of us, all of us must hold. That is how a chain turns into a line. His mouth set into a new shape, the look of someone who has made a decision he cannot unmake. From the barn, a lantern flared. Shadows crossed the slats like bars. The wind shifted, and with Yet a scent of iron, rain, and choice. Margaret slipped the last blindfold into her pocket. The courtyard, empty now, kept the memory of bodies falling gently, of rage denied its spectacle, of a people rehearsing independence in the space of a breath. She lifted her face to the gathering dark and felt the world tilt toward revelation. Somewhere inside that tilt, betrayal tightened its gloves. Somewhere else, resolve sharpened its edge. And as night pressed down, the journey narrowed again, the path closing to a single doorway where decisions become fate and fate demands a witness. The captain arrived like a storm in polished leather. He pushed through the ranks with a glare that tried to turn men back into dust. "What is this circus?" he demanded, voice slicing the air. "You turn His Majesty's order into theater." Margaret did not step aside. She opened the manual to the pages marked by her husband's rough hand and held it so the morning light struck the ink. "Every gesture you—" "Witness stands here," she said quietly. "Posture, restraint, verified threat, controlled response. Your law, not mine." The captain reached for words and found none. He saw Briggs, the sergeant drenched in sweat, breath ragged, pride in tatters, standing before farmers who no longer bent their necks. Silence did what insults could not. It unmasked authority. A ripple of awareness moved through the colonists. Dignity is not granted. It is claimed. He recovered enough to sneer. "You exploit a book. To weaken discipline." Margaret turned a page. "Then let discipline defend itself." She handed the manual to Peter. The boy held it like a flag. Around them, women from the kitchens paused with buckets. A gray-bearded militiaman straightened his crooked back. A child clutched an empty tin drum as if it were a shield. The captain's gaze slid over their faces with the indifference of a banker counting debts. "This encampment exists for imperial training," he said, measuring each word. "Not for colonial vanity." Margaret's tone did not rise. "Vanity is forcing a people to kneel and calling it order. What we practiced was control, the opposite of riot." His jaw flexed. He looked again at Briggs, who would not meet his eyes. Humiliation hung like smoke no wind could lift. Hargreaves stepped in, smooth as lacquer. "Captain," he said, "there has been an interpretation of procedure. A gentler blade meant to cut the same." The captain dismissed the euphemism with a flick of contempt. "Interpretation breeds rebellion." He pointed at Margaret. "She is the source of it." The word landed with weight. Rebellion. The colonists felt it vibrate in their ribs. Not an insult now, but a diagnosis. Something alive, something that does not ask permission to breathe. Briggs seized the moment to recover, spitting out a grievance about insolence, about peasants turned arrogant. Yet even as he spoke, his voice faltered. He had lost the one weapon he trusted, laughter. The courtyard refused to give it back. Margaret asked for permission to address the men. Hargreaves hesitated. The captain scoffed. She spoke anyway, not loudly, only steady. "Discipline without justice is a leash. Discipline with purpose is a road. Today we chose the road." She looked at the women. "Our sons will walk it." She looked at the elders. "Our dead built it." She looked at the children. "You will finish it." No cheers rose. This was not a moment for noise. It was a vow poured into the cracks humiliation had left behind. The captain shifted, unsettled by a calm he could not command. Then the hidden truth surfaced. A clerk arrived from the barn with a sealed paper, red wax stamped, edges still warm. He offered it to Hargreaves, who broke the seal with a thumbnail and read. His eyes hardened by increments. "By order of the regional command," he announced, "instructors of non-commissioned status acting without direct British oversight are to be removed for review. Effective immediately." The words were clothed in law, but their bones were betrayed. Removal meant disappearance. Review meant darkness. The colonists understood before the syllables finished falling. The captain's mouth curled into satisfaction. Briggs found his grin again, thinner now, but sharpened by spite. "Order restored," he breathed. Margaret neither flinched nor pleaded. "This is your decision," she said. "Let the record show it." She lifted her chin toward Peter, and the boy stepped forward with the manual clutched to his chest. "What record?" the captain mocked. "Paper obeys pay." Margaret nodded once to the ring of faces around her. Memory remembers debt better than ink. The kitchen girl wiped flour on her apron and stood taller. The old militiaman put aside his stick and squared his shoulders. Farmers adjusted their stance as if some invisible drum had set a new beat. Not violence. Readiness. Not fury. Resolve. Hargreaves gestured to the guard. Two soldiers approached with the tidy politeness of well-paid men. "Come peacefully," one murmured. Margaret offered her wrists without resistance. No chains, yet the gesture felt heavier than iron. Peter took half a step, halted by Margaret's eyes alone. She did not beg. She did not announce martyrdom. She simply met each recruit's gaze in turn, sealing decisions in silence. "Hold your line," she said. 3 words, soft as linen, strong as oak. Briggs hissed a threat about what the night would bring. She answered with nothing at all. "Some victories speak only to the spine." They led her past the barn. The door wore shadows like bars. Inside, the world smelled of hay, old oil, and secrets. The captain followed, eager to witness submission. The recruits remained at the threshold, unsure if stepping closer would ignite doom or courage. The sun slid behind a bank of cloud, and the yard dimmed as if the day itself withheld its blessing. A chicken clucked, absurd and holy. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell, broken long ago, gave a single tired note. The world seemed to nod at the moment and keep walking. In the gloom, Margaret felt the weight of her husband's ring against her skin. She remembered the march he never returned from, the promises she buried and later exhumed. Sacrifice had always had a face. Now it borrowed hers. She thought of the manual's margins, the calm script of a man who believed in a country that did not yet exist. She thought of the boys outside, the women with raw hands, the elders who had buried. Too many winters. She would not let them drown in someone else's shame. Your empire is a house built on orders, she said to no one, to everyone. Our liberty is a house built on decisions. The captain motioned to a table where a ledger lay open. Names were listed in neat lines, inked like verdicts. He dipped a quill and asked for her mark, a signature to legitimize removal. She looked at the page, then at him. I will not confirm my erasure, she said. He smirked. Then we do it for you. He signed her absence into being with an elegant flourish. That flourish was the mask falling from law. Hargreaves watched, trapped between polished cruelty and the faint, inconvenient tug of conscience. The guard shifted, uneasy with the taste of disgrace. Outside, Peter stood with the manual hidden under his coat. The boy's hands shook, then stilled. He turned to the colonist and spoke for the first time with a voice that belonged to a man. We keep the rule, he said. We hold, we do not strike. First, but we do not kneel. The words were simple. They traveled like fire laid to dry straw. The merchant who had spat before looked away. The noble's ribbon seemed suddenly foolish. Even Briggs sensed that brutality alone could not choke this root. Margaret met the guard's eyes and nodded. I will walk, she said. They escorted her toward the far building, a small, windowless store where reviews happened out of sight. The sky broke open with a thin rain, each drop a cold blessing. The courtyard did not disperse. Poor men and thin women and worn elders stood in the drizzle, refusing to take shelter while dignity walked through water. The captain barked for them to clear the yard. No one moved. Indifference met authority and did not blink. Rain beaded on redcoats and homespun alike, erasing the line paint had drawn. At the threshold, Margaret paused. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She felt them, a quiet nation forming where humiliation had tried to grow weeds. Rebellion had shed swagger and found discipline. Betrayal had revealed character. The transformation was not complete, but it had begun, and beginnings ignore permission. She let the door's darkness swallow her and stepped inside. Behind her, the bell that had given one tired note seemed to gather itself for another, and in that waiting, in that breath between chime and echo, the journey bent toward a reckoning that was already writing its name. They brought her back into the light with rain, still clinging to her hair. The yard had become a congregation. Women with pails, boys with raw hands, elders with backs like bowed trees. Hargreaves stood before them, jaw tight, ledger closed. The captain waited with a curl on his lip, ready to savor the final stamp of domination. Then the words changed the air. Sergeant Briggs, Hargreaves announced, voice carrying like a bell that refused to crack, is relieved of duty for conduct unbecoming, effective immediately. It was not mercy. It was strategy. But it was also truth forced into public view. Shame fell from the sky with the rain and struck the redcoats first. Briggs tried to protest. The sound died in his throat. He looked smaller, as if the uniform had shrunk around him. No one laughed now. Even contempt had grown quiet. The colonists did not cheer. They shared glances that said more than noise could hold respect given to Margaret without ceremony, allegiance sealed with restraint. She did not bow or raise her chin to claim victory. She stood still, the bruise on her face a faded testament, the manual at Peter's side a relic and a sword. The humiliation of yesterday had turned upon itself and fallen like a rotten beam in a grand house. The captain searched for a new weapon. Do not mistake correction for concession, he warned. But his words carried less iron. Order will be restored. He signaled to have Briggs escorted away. 2 soldiers took the disgraced sergeant by the arms, and for a breath the crowd parted, as if making room for a funeral. Briggs kept his eyes on the mud. Pride had exploded silently inside him and left smoke in his gaze. Margaret watched him go with neither triumph nor pity, only recognition. Tyranny collapses first in the spirit, then in the street. Hargreaves faced the colonists. Training will continue under proper oversight, he declared, attempting to glue authority back together. No further deviations. Margaret lifted the manual and opened to the signed page. A definition, she said, calm as a psalm. So does justice. Her tone did not ask, it measured. The commander held her stare a heartbeat too long. Something in him flinched, not fear, not respect, perhaps a faint memory of dignity he had traded for rank. The rain thinned to a gray mist. The kitchen girl stepped closer to Margaret, offering a clean cloth. A militiaman with trembling fingers touched the brim of his hat to her and then to the sky. Children stood on the edges, faces stark, learning a ritual older than flags. Witness replaces shouting when truth is enough. Peter shifted his weight and held the manual higher as if the book could shield a town. In that gesture lived a revelation. The law of an empire can be turned by the conscience of its victims. The captain moved to dismiss everyone, but the camp did not move at his command. They moved at Margaret's glance. She raised a hand. Quiet rippled outward like light over deep water. Back to work, she said simply. Posture, measure, resolve. No one broke ranks. People do not abandon a road once they see it leading somewhere worth the trudge. The British officers retreated to the barn again, whispering through clenched teeth, counting losses not in bodies but in obedience. Numbers are comforting to men who have misplaced their souls. Briggs stumbled once as he was led away. He looked up, found Margaret, and spat a raw curse. She did not answer. She did not need to. His removal had taught more than his presence ever could. Power can be disciplined. Authority can be forced to kneel to its own rules. The colonists absorbed this knowledge like bread after famine. Not ecstasy, not vengeance. Nourishment. As the yard broke into tasks, Margaret walked the line. She corrected a stance with 2 fingers. She steadied an old man's elbow. She taught a child where to place his feet so fear had less room to run. Every touch was small. Every correction was a stone in a road no crown had built. The bruise on her face faded, but the mark on the day darkened. What had begun as a spectacle of disgrace had become a rite of transformation. When noon came, the clouds lifted and left a stark light over everything. The field looked almost clean. It wasn't. The ground remembered. So did the people. Hargreaves re-emerged with the captain at his shoulder, each holding a different silence. The commander spoke first, careful now. Instructor Hale, he said without the sneer that had been routine, your methods will be monitored. No. Further demonstrations without express permission. Margaret inclined her head the smallest degree. Then watch closely. The captain bristled. The phrase held no threat. It carried a promise. Nothing would be hidden again. Whispers threaded through the colonists. Rumors of harsher measures, of lists growing teeth, of a midnight wagon with no lantern. Betrayal travels faster than bread. Margaret felt it in her bones. She also felt the counterbeat, the one that breathes under sorrow. The poor will not be frightened forever. The wounded learn patience that emperors cannot kill. She gathered Peter, Thomas, the gray-bearded militiaman, the kitchen girl, and a widow who had brought water every day since the drills began. If they come for me, she said, you hold the rule. Peter nodded, eyes steady now. The others nodded too. Decisions had ripened behind their faces. Afternoon drills resumed. Quiet, exact. No blindfolds this time. Only the rhythm of steps and the soft thud of boots claiming. A future. The captain prowled the edges, hungry for error. He found none. Rage thinned him. He whispered to Hargreaves. Hargreaves answered with a shrug that tried to look like command and looked instead like fatigue. A fly landed on the captain's cuff. He swatted too hard. The gesture betrayed him, impulse without aim. Margaret saw it and almost smiled. Toward evening, a wagon rolled in from the road, wheels groaning. 2 clerks jumped down with a crate stamped with the royal crest, sealed. Writs, new regulations, punishments folded into parchment. The captain broke the seal with a flourish meant to impress the sky. He began to read. Curfews, reduced rations for known compliance, immediate detention for unauthorized assembly. The words dripped like tar. The crowd stiffened. Margaret waited for the last decree. It came like a spike. Instructors operating outside commission are to be escorted to regional headquarters at dusk. Not review this time. Removal. No rumor now. A mandate. Hargreaves did not look at her. He looked at the ledger, as if numbers might absolve him. The guard formed a rank. The captain smiled, that polished smile that never reaches the eyes. Order, he said softly, savoring it. The yard felt the temperature drop without wind. The humiliation they had returned to its senders sought a new path back. Margaret stepped forward before fear could scatter. You will not touch the boys, she said. You will not touch the women. You will not touch the old. The captain opened his mouth to jeer, but something in the yard, some low sound like a single breath shared by many, made him close it again. She turned to her people. Remember the vow, she said. No first strike. She did not add the rest. They knew it anyway, no retreat of the spirit. The guard advanced, careful, as if approaching a flame that looked like water. Margaret offered her hands. Peter held the manual tight and met Hargreaves's eyes with a gaze that made the older man age another year. The commander looked away. They began the walk. Past the well, past the barn that had swallowed too many evenings, past the place where her blood had dried and truth had taken root. The colonists followed at a distance that defied dispersal and stopped short of provocation. A line, not a mob. A people in rehearsal for nationhood. The wagon waited with its mouth open. The captain gestured as if inviting a guest to supper. Margaret climbed without help. From the backboard, as the reins snapped and the wheels jerked, she saw the field tilt and catch itself. She saw the kitchen girl hand her pail to the old militiaman like a passing of command. She saw Thomas rest a steady palm on Peter's shoulder, grounding the boy as a tree roots soil. She saw Hargreaves hesitate and fail to change. Choices brand a man before they touch his skin. The wagon rolled toward the road and the trees beyond. Rain returned, fine as breath. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the ring press her palm. A circle of metal, a circle of oath. Pride had fallen today, but pride never falls alone. It drags rafters with it, loosens stones, reveals what the house is made of. She listened for hoofbeats behind, for a shout, for the first crack in the mask of law. None came yet. Only the wheels grind and the quiet march of feet that did not scatter. Night drew its curtain across the farm, slow and absolute. The last thing she heard from the yard was not a cry, not a pledge, but the measured cadence of drill heels. Braced, breaths aligned, carried by a people who had learned to hold their ground while the darkness chose its shape. The road bent into the trees, and with it, the journey curved toward a revelation waiting just beyond the next bend where orders meet conscience and one of them must yield. The sky burned faintly gold before surrendering to dusk. Margaret stood alone in the middle of the field, her boots sinking into the wet earth that had witnessed humiliation, defiance, and rebirth. The wind brushed against her cheek, stinging where pride had once struck her flesh. She breathed in the scent of rain and smoke, of hay and powder, and let silence settle like armor around her. Each slow movement of her arm, each deliberate strike in the air was not practice, it was remembrance. Every gesture recalled the faces that had watched her fall and then rise without fury. She repeated the movements her husband had once taught her, but now they meant something greater. They were no longer the defense of one person's honor, but the promise of an entire people's dignity. In the distance, the faint toll of village bells drifted through the mist. It was not a hymn of peace, but a warning. More troops were coming, more redcoats, more rules dressed as justice. The empire was gathering its weight again, trying to crush the spark that refused to die. Margaret paused mid-strike, her hand trembling for the first time, not with fear, but with understanding. Liberty is never born in sunlight. It crawls from the shadow of disgrace and learns to stand only when all else kneels. She lowered her arm and looked toward the horizon. The line of soldiers would appear soon, glittering under a false banner of order. Let them come, she thought. Let them see what endurance looks like when humiliation turns to fire. Behind her, the barn door creaked open. Peter stepped out, holding the manual tight against his chest. His boots were caked in mud, but his eyes were clear. Around him gathered the faces of those who had trained under her, the farmer, the widow, the child with the tin drum. None spoke. They didn't need to. The transformation had already taken root in them. Each of them now carried the same steady calm she had taught, the power to fight without hatred, to resist without losing the soul. Even the smallest among them understood that the journey had changed. It was no longer about weapons or drills. It was about worth, about proving that a nation could be built not from gold or lineage, but from sacrifice and choice. The first thunder rolled beyond the hills, echoing like the pulse of drums. Margaret straightened. The sound wasn't just weather, it was the world shifting, the herald of an age that could not be stopped. Freedom, once a whisper, now moved through them like a storm disguised as breath. She thought of her husband again, of his last words spoken on the battlefield before silence took him. Discipline wins when rage fails. He had died believing it, and now she lived to prove it. The British had their ranks, their titles, their polished cruelty. The colonists had only their hearts, their bruises, and their faith in the idea that no chain is eternal. That was enough. It had always been enough. As the final bell faded into twilight, she lowered her arms and faced her students, no longer recruits, but patriots. They will come for us, she said softly, but when they do, they'll find something stronger than rebellion. They'll find men and women who remember who they are. Her words fell like embers onto dry ground, and in every heart a small flame caught. Not fury, conviction, the kind of fire that waits for dawn. Margaret walked toward the flagpole, the cloth damp and heavy in her hands. It wasn't a nation's flag yet, just fabric sewn by hands that had known hunger, but as she tied it, the wind lifted it with a whisper. It fluttered weakly, then caught a gust, and rose, torn but defiant. The colonists watched, silent, as if witnessing the first breath of a living thing. No cheers, no trumpets, only the sound of a people remembering their own worth beneath a sky that no longer felt foreign. In that moment, Margaret understood that victory would not come from battles or signatures. It would come from endurance, from every nameless act of courage buried in the soil. It would come from widows who refused to be silent, from farmers who stood unarmed before soldiers, from children who learned that truth outlives tyranny. The British could crush fields, burn barns, hang men, but they could not unteach dignity. They could not command the human soul back into obedience once it had glimpsed its own reflection. The horizon darkened. The bells stopped. Margaret's shadow stretched long across the field like a bridge between two worlds, the dying empire and the nation not yet born. She whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for strength to finish the path she had chosen. For all their cruelty, the enemy had given her one gift: clarity. She knew now that liberty is not granted. It is inherited in defiance, baptized in pain, and guarded by those willing to stand when others kneel. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of smoke from the distant ridge. It might have been the enemy's camp. It might have been the spark of something far greater. She raised her head to the fading light, her eyes reflecting the first stars of the night. Before the guns, she murmured, "Comes the spirit," and her spirit did not bend. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of their struggle, the pulse of their courage, then let your mark be known. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and stand with us, Patriot. Your support keeps this flame alive, and together we carry the fire of liberty forward.